Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome back to the program Aaron Sobczak. Aaron joins us today, not only as a Young Voices contributor, but Aaron, I got to congratulate you on being a new dad. Way to go.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So for those who are meeting you for the first time, take just a moment and tell us just a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, real briefly, you got it right. My name's Aaron Sobczak, recent graduate with a master's degree. Currently, I'm working as a foreign policy reporter at the famous restraint-oriented Quincy Institute. I also contribute quite a bit at outlets like the Mises Wire, Mises Institute, as well on the side.
Well, I'm looking at an article you wrote for International Policy Digest. That the title is Trump's Win Sinks Zelensky's Victory Plan. And I know a lot of things are poised to change with the incoming Trump administration. Let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. It seems like the current administration's been very, very generous in terms of monetary and military aid. What are the biggest changes we're going to see when Trump takes power in January?
You know, it's hard to say how much substantial change there will be versus rhetorical change when Trump gets into office. I do believe he has a concept of a plan, as he put it, and I believe that concept is kind of him using his business lingo and business ideas to think about a plan that would make both sides, at least satisfied in some way. You know, obviously Biden and several members of NATO were trying to quote unquote Trump-proof the Ukraine aid and Ukraine assistance before Trump got into office. That included things like escalating the conflict by allowing Ukraine to send ATACMS missiles deep into Russian territory, as well as increasing last-minute aid sent to Zelensky before the end of Biden's term. What Trump might actually do is honestly hard to say. There's a possibility a real peace plan could happen, which would include probably the tacit recognition that not all of the territory that Ukraine once held will be Ukrainian from now on, especially like Crimea and parts of Zaporozhye or Donetsk. But I'm not sure if it's also off the table to put the rest of Ukraine in NATO, or at least a more firm security under a more firm security blanket moving forward. I think Trump thinks in transactional terms, which is probably the right way to think about the world stage. So we'll just have to wait and see how much of his rhetoric becomes reality once he's in office.
Aaron, I don't spend a ton of my time focused on foreign policy. I'm putting out fires closer to home. But from my limited vantage point, I can't shake this feeling that the outgoing administration not only is, in the words of Anthony Blinken, shoveling every dollar possible toward Ukraine, but there's an appearance to me that they're trying to actively escalate the conflict, which has been somewhat of a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. I'd like to get your take on it. I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I would love to get your assessment. That's what I think I'm seeing. What are you seeing from your vantage point?
Yeah, the word proxy is a really good term all around right now to use, not just between the US and Ukraine, but really between maybe a West and then a non-Western or dissident voices, rest of the world, who are trying to operate independent of the West's hegemonic reach, of course, led by the United States. In terms of how much aid they're sending, yeah, next to Israel, Ukraine is getting about the most aid we've ever sent any country in a year. And Ukraine, many experts, both that support the U.S. involvement and disagree with U.S. involvement, point to the idea that NATO is sending just enough aid to continue the war, prolong the war, but not enough aid for Ukraine to win it. And I think that's a pretty accurate depiction of what's going on right now. Obviously, there are defense contractors' pockets to line. There is a proxy aspect of it where the United States and I think other European powers want to weaken Russia. And in terms of taking a step even further back and looking at the proxy aspect, we just had the Syrian civil war reignite briefly and had Bashar al-Assad taken down by by rebels, HTS. At least formally funded by the United States, if not currently supported by the United States. And you know who else was supporting HTS in their fight against Assad? Ukraine. Ukraine was, sending weapons and munitions to these rebels because Assad is, after all, for the most part, a staunch ally of Russia, of Moscow. So this proxy, this term proxy, is certainly relevant within Ukraine, Russia, but all around the world we see, kind of the NATO partnership allies versus the maybe NATO dissident or Western dissident partnership allies going against each other in proxy wars or Cold Wars.
I have to ask your opinion on this too. Without the help, the advice, the arming, help of NATO, would Ukraine have been able to emerge victorious over Russia, or is that something they could not have accomplished on their own?
Well, no, I mean, frankly, I think if I can't say exactly how much further Russia would be without NATO's help right now. Um, I think there is an aspect of Russia not wanting to trigger too many of NATO's red lines and therefore explicitly militarily involve the United States or France or Germany. I mean, I do think that at the very least we'd be at where we are now, where Russia is clearly in the lead, although it's probably going a bit slower than Vladimir Putin would have wanted it to. Um, and then in terms of how much aid, I mean, I think the only solution that would have ensured a straight up Ukrainian victory, an outright Ukrainian victory, would have been an outright declaration of war by most of NATO, which would have tantamounted to a World War III, is what would have happened there. So I think a situation where we maybe go back to the 2022 peace plans that were taking place in Turkey that were scuttled. Some kind of peace plan is probably the best route moving forward. Not to say that, Putin is justified in all of his actions or that we should, try to appease every country every time it tries to overpower its weaker neighbor, assuming that's the narrative here. But at the very least, we should look at this through a realist lens and recognize that the only way we can really firmly win in Ukraine would be to have an all-out NATO versus Russian war, which I don't think anyone would want if we got down to the brass tacks of it.
You mentioned NATO's red lines, and I know Russia has red lines as well. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know how much is just talk and how much is like, well, we should probably take this serious. But it sounds like, there is talk that we are right on the brink of nuclear conflict if those red lines continue to be pushed. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's very clear that Russia has red lines. I think that's in large part why the Ukraine invasion happened was because of those red lines being violated. Ambassador Burns' "Niet means Niet" 2008 memo was leaked by WikiLeaks, and this memo was sent to high-up members of the State Department as well as the president, basically indicating that Ukraine is considered one of the key former Warsaw Pact states that needs to remain neutral in Asia. I'm sorry, in Europe. And as soon as NATO started, and Bill Clinton especially started indicating that we would be seeking to put Ukraine into NATO and breaking promises along the way, both U.S. ambassador as well as Russian diplomats started to sound the alarm and say this would be, on Russia's border, an adversary organization expanding to Russia's border. It would be similar to if a Warsaw Pact expanded to Mexico back during the Cold War. So in terms of red lines, Russia clearly has some. Now, in terms of what could happen once those red lines are breached, that's more speculative, of course. Um, Russia has changed their nuclear doctrine, after the ATACMS were allowed by the United States. Creating more leeway into when Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. Now, I'm not sure if this will turn into a nuclear war outright. I think part of what's happening is Putin is waiting to see what the new administration will do and doesn't want to jump the gun before Trump has a chance to get in there and institute some kind of actual peace. I'm not super confident in Trump's ability to do so, but it's certainly, I don't think he wants to jump the gun when Biden's right on the way out.
Again, we're talking with Aaron Sobczak. He is a Young Voices contributor. Aaron, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate being on.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Always happy to see Alex Rosado pop up in the rotation, and he is back to join us for today's episode. Alex, great to see you once again. For those meeting you for the first time, take a moment and just tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So thanks again for having me on. I'm Alex Rosado. I am currently a professional programs assistant at the Alexander Hamilton Society. And as a disclaimer, everything that I say within this podcast is representative of me and my own opinions and not the organizations.
All right. So there are no topics off the table. Well, almost none. Actually, we have a great article that you wrote for the Political Insider about reviving the National Garden of American Heroes. And I got to tell you, this hit me on a couple of different levels just because I've seen so much division in the last, I'm going to say the last 15 years that I've really paid attention to it. It seems like we've really become very polarized, and it's hard to point out who would constitute a hero in modern day America. I'm wondering what you're seeing from your vantage point.
Well, you are absolutely correct about the polarization aspect of everything. It is at a decades high, and that comes with the cost of personal relationships, and it's very unfortunate that it happens to American families, neighborhoods, and communities across the nation where you're seeing that these differences in political ideologies have rippled into their personal lives. And it's also affected our outlook on other institutions, such as the media, how we have faith in Congress, and other parts of our daily lives where we should be working in cohesion, but we're breaking apart at the seams. So in a time of desperate measures, usually that's when a hero comes about. And you need somebody or something to look up to in order to restore national faith and an identity that, at least in my generation of Gen Z, many people are starting to lose faith in and can't really proclaim how and why they are an American. So I think having focal points of reference, such as a National Garden of Heroes that is proposed by President Trump, I think would be a fantastic policy in order to make sure that we have those focal points and lessons that we can learn from, so that way we can better mold our future according to the past.
I have to say, one of the more disturbing aspects, particularly within the last decade or so, has been the movement to erase heroes or to rewrite heroes. And I'm not saying that every one of these people were saints who walked on water, but we've seen schools renamed, statues torn down, and portraits removed, because there's kind of a revision of history that's taking place because people that were once considered heroic or that played a heroic role in the nation's founding or other historic events are suddenly persona non grata.
Absolutely. And to those who are engaging within a revisionist history, it has a social and ideological agenda behind it. And the way that the National Garden of Heroes came about was originally within 2020 due to the George Floyd riots that happened that rocked our nation. Shuttered small businesses and local communities were scared for security reasons. And many people saw that a lot of these current institutions weren't exactly reflective of the national zeitgeist at the time. So they went in with their big erasers and they started scrubbing a lot of things, whether it be major institutions by their names or just getting rid of them altogether, to even more symbolic gestures, such as removing the Land of Lakes lady from the butter. But still, even with these little changes, it's still the same institutions at the end of the day, but it also comes with Americans not knowing their history as well as they might. And especially this is reflected within literacy tests, especially within history across our nation's schools that should be doing more to foster a holistic education and not sidelining certain events or figures just because it fits a social narrative that they think is going to better us all when in fact it's actually dividing us. So really, we just need more of a holistic education when it comes to historical figures, because committing to America means acknowledging its high points and its low points, its triumphs and its trauma. And we need to make sure that the America that is yet to be can be best molded by what has been.
I can give you an example of what that looks like. And this is from about, 4 years ago, roughly. A friend of mine took her sons and traveled back east, visited Monticello, visited, Mount Vernon. And she said it was very discouraging to take her boys through these historic places. And the docents who, were responsible for these historical places and helping people understand them, it seems like the focus had shifted entirely away from Thomas Jefferson and away from George Washington. And it was more on, well, this is where the slaves were kept, and here are their stories. And that became almost the sole focus of the tours.
Well, you see what that does to the actual American populace when you focus on negativity instead of the positives. Yes, we need to acknowledge that there are certain events and practices that were not the best apt for America. But it's also important to acknowledge the local context and the historical context of which they came in as well. And as America has continued evolving as the best experiment for freedom, for association, for expanding political and consumer liberty, we've been able to fine tune our practices to make sure that these are not only the best that are in place for the world to copy as a role model, but also for those to learn from and especially have a higher quality of living, higher standards, something that we can aspire to be and have a long-term goal. Now, cancel culture unfortunately does and underdoes all of that by saying that we need to focus on what is terrible. Even if you had a flawless track record and there's one mistake, you focus on that one mistake. But in America, we know that we are not defined by our mistakes, but we know that our trajectory going forth is going to correct that and make sure that that doesn't happen again. Because it is ever evolving, much like the world. And so is our narrative, so is our story. And of course, we need to have characters within our story. So take the best that we can learn from so we can learn from them as well.
I like in your article how you call for that fuller, more nuanced understanding of our past. You actually made me think about C.S. Lewis, who talked about, I think it was called chronological snobbery, where we assume, well, we have all the answers, and therefore we're so much smarter and so much brighter than everyone who came before us. And his point was, look, the people who came before us did great things, but they also had blind spots. And the lesson we should take away from that is we have blind spots as well, and someone down the road is probably going to be looking at us going, what the heck were they thinking?
Well, that brings up one of the criticisms that was levied towards the National Garden of Heroes proposal. There were certain historians, one of them even compared the idea to Stalinist Russia,
Wow.
saying that this is a totalitarian regime tactic to make sure that this is the history that people learn from and not the actual understanding or events that transpired. Well, remember that totalitarians disrespect history. They're the ones who try and rewrite it at any cost. They don't engage in its remembrance, and this is a physical embodiment of the history and the mores that comprise America in its good times and its bads. And also Trump's acknowledgement of having people from all over the rich tapestry of sciences, the arts, from politics to humanities, everything, all across the social and political aisle. It was an initiative that started with 31 figures. Then over time, it transpired into 244 figures. So that shows the breadth of figures right there, but also shows the diversity of America, not because of aesthetics, but because of merit, because of representation and who they stand for and what they fought for or against. And this is something that is going to have a long-lasting influence far beyond President Trump's term.
And you point out in your article, and I'm going to ask you to take one moment and just talk about what qualifies someone as an American hero.
Someone who inspires the betterment of the nation and its people. And especially from what you see today, there is a lack of empathy in the public mindset. They're all fixed over absolutes, and especially in a society that doesn't really know what it wants or who it wants to be, we need inspiration once again. And these are timeless values as well that all of these people embody, from Red Cloud to Sojourner Truth to Martin Luther King to Nellie Gray. All of them encompass that liberty comes first. And that is something that is bestowed to the people. And you need a pioneer that can step up against adversity, not be scared of it. Someone who can take on the tough battles, not just win them, but have bravery enough to stand up against oppressive forces, wherever they may be, whatever form it may come in, and reap something that all of America can be better with. They didn't know that they didn't need it, but now that it's here, they won't forget it. And trust me, when they get remembered within the National Garden of Heroes, we will not forget them either.
I actually saw your call for this National Garden of Heroes as a call to also cultivate heroes in our time. And maybe that's a discussion we can have down the road. Again, we're talking with Alex Rosado. Alex, where can people find you on social media? Where can they follow your work?
You can find me on Twitter/X at Alex P. Rosado.
Thank you so much. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you. Welcome back. This is our third segment on today's Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome David Mendoza back to the program. David, for those meeting you for the very first time, take a moment, talk about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I'm a graduate of Westminster Seminary, California. I currently teach humanities at a Great Books school in Northern California. I like writing on religion, theology, and I guess more recently now towards geopolitics in the Middle East. And so thank you again for having me.
Hey, I'm looking at an article you wrote for realclearhistory.com, and I have to say, I'm not familiar with Ta-Nehisi, am I saying that name correct? Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I understand that Ta-Nehisi Coates has been making the rounds, promoting a new book, and the subtitle here is that the history of this person's history of injustice is actually unjust itself. Can you tell me, first of all, who exactly is Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Ta-Nehisi Coates is a writer. He's currently, I believe, a professor of English actually at Howard University. But he gained some notoriety early, I think in 2016, for an essay that he wrote called The Case for Reparations. And in this sort of was the springboard on his writing career that led to the publication of a book called Between the World and Me. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates has written extensively on American racism, and talked about his own experiences of racism and being the son of Jim Crow survivors or grandparents that survived through Jim Crow. So he's certainly a significant figure in the political discourse today.
Well, and it looks like in his book, The Message, he wades right into the middle of one of the messier conflicts of our time, that being the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What can you tell me about his book, The Message?
His book, The Message, really opens up with his attempt at articulating how stories shape society. You know, societies tell themselves stories, origin stories that make us view the world and ourselves in particular ways. Really intriguing idea, to be honest. Even Glenn Lowry actually had a positive thing to say about it. But then he goes on a trip to various countries, including in Africa, and he goes to the Jim Crow South, or excuse me, the former Jim Crow South, to see where certain areas where he claims that books of his have been banned. And the last chapter really talks about his 10-day trip to Israel, and seeing what he called, or what he perceived as being, a form of apartheid in Israel that he said was analogous to the Jim Crow South. And it really is the last chapter of this book that's been getting the most attention, most notably from his initial CBS Mornings interview, where he actually got some pushback from one of the journalists on the show.
Wow. You know, on the one hand, I'll give him props because that's one of the touchier subjects in our day and age. On the other hand, as you point out in your article, it looks like he may be oversimplifying the situation. Tell me a little bit about his take on what is behind that conflict.
Yeah, he basically argues that the Palestinians are under a form of apartheid that is analogous to the Jim Crow South and apartheid in South Africa. And he bases this off of certain observations that he made in various interviews and in the book. Basically his perception of how Palestinians were treated over there, going into the West Bank and seeing the restrictions that were placed upon Palestinians, the checkpoints that are there. And he basically argues that, I've seen this before. He said that in an interview with Trevor Noah, actually, I know what this is, sort of implying that, you know, my family also went through something like this. So because of my heritage, in fact, he said this also on the CBS Mornings interview, and he's repeated it, because of my ancestry, my family heritage of slavery and Jim Crow, I have this sort of special insight to tell where apartheid exists. And he basically says that Israel is an apartheid state. This is a claim that really is devoid of any sort of historical context. He doesn't take into consideration certain nuances or particular histories with Israel, including the safety measures that are in place. When it comes to even the checkpoints, basically, he says that that is analogous to Jim Crow segregation, where Black people could not eat or drink in the same spaces as white people in the South. And because of that, that this is a form of injustice as he sees it. The problem is that this doesn't fit the narrative that he wants to put out there. It's not analogous to American or even Western categories of racism and apartheid. There is something specific here and more nuanced that most Israelis are familiar with, and Westerners typically have a hard time understanding because it's a context they don't quite understand.
So I have heard the word apartheid for most of my life. Growing up and coming of age in the 1980s, I remember the pressure on South Africa to end its apartheid policies. I would be hard-pressed to give someone an accurate definition of what that term means. And I'm not asking you for a textbook definition, but for those of us who I've heard the word many times, but I'm not sure I really understand it. When we hear the word apartheid, what does that actually refer to?
Well, it really refers to a system of segregation and oppression based on skin color. And it was coined basically with the regime in South Africa. And when one looks at the situation in Israel and Palestine, it's not based upon skin color per se. Now, people can argue, that the Palestinians are a different ethnic group, and because of that, or because of their religion, that they are kept on basically a different level of society or a different status or have less rights per se. But what they're really talking about is certain sections in Judea and Samaria that require these checkpoints because of past attacks on Jewish people in Israel by people within the West Bank and in Gaza. And the threat of bus bombings, which have happened, is constantly there. And so these safety measures were put in place to protect Jewish people from being harmed. It's not the same, though, as developing a system of segregation strictly based off of racial hatred or racial supremacy. So that's what I would say is apartheid, and that's just simply not what the Jewish state is doing. Now, many Israelis will argue it is not ideal, and many will say even that it's unfair. But the charge of apartheid is really not accurate and meant to just demonize Israel as a nation, broadly speaking, at least.
So this is probably, I think you point this out in the article, more of a case of Ta-Nehisi Coates appropriating that conflict and then applying the emotions and the dynamic of that conflict to his own, I guess his own agenda, which is race politics in America.
Yeah, I think I do use the word appropriate in the article. There was something kind of, I argued a little, well, not even just a little, there was something unjust about him using that for a particular agenda. And one of the things I also pointed out was the parallels between people like him and people like the podcaster Daryl Cooper, who was recently interviewed by Tucker Carlson earlier this year, trying to sort of hijack the narrative of and the legacy of Winston Churchill in World War II, really because he has a gripe with the military-industrial complex. And so in a similar way to that, Coates has a particular agenda he wants to advance, and he wants to use and appropriate the Israel-Palestine conflict to advance his own views on racism in the United States.
David, I've got about 30 seconds here, but I have to ask you, for people who want to get better information, or at least unbiased information on that conflict in Israel and Palestine, what would you recommend?
I would recommend a number of writers at the Free Press who I think have done very good work on this area. So Barry Weiss and Eli Lake have done a lot of work. I would say Coleman Hughes. And I would also recommend Adam Kirsch's recent book on settler colonialism, where he talks about some of the ideas promoted by Ta-Nehisi Coates and Mark Lamont Hill, and how it doesn't really hold up. This sort of settler colonial ideology doesn't hold up with the Israel-Palestine conflict.
All right, we've been talking with David Mendoza. David, where can people find you on social media?
They can find me on dmendoza62 on Twitter, and that's my Twitter handle at least. So you can find me there, where I post some of my work. And yeah, thank you very much.
And welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. We're happy to welcome Sam Rouse back to the program. Sam, for those meeting you for the first time, take just a moment to tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. So I am a Tech and Consumer Freedom Fellow with Young Voices, which is a group of young writers sharing different political perspectives through writing and broadcast media. I've been particularly focused on issues affecting our emerging and evolving tech sector and the connections between our economic concerns and our national security concerns. And, those a lot of times are at contention and that intersection. And it's really important for us to land correctly on a lot of policy issues to continue to prosper and live as a free country.
Boy, that sounds like an avenue that would keep you very, very busy. In particular, I'm curious about your article in the Washington Examiner. Trump should let the clock run out on TikTok. Now, I haven't heard Trump say a lot about TikTok. Can you fill me in on what is his stance on this platform, and what exactly is the clock going to be running out on?
Yeah, so about a year or so ago, both Trump and Biden and pretty much all major leaders of both parties began raising a lot of concerns about what is largely still classified intelligence information being collected regarding China's operations being a Chinese-based company, and the unique corporate governance structure of Chinese companies gives the CCP a lot of leeway to access information to influence business decisions. As we know, they're not a free country, or they don't enjoy free markets. And so both the sitting president and the former president began to raise alarms about the potential need to force TikTok to divest from it being a Chinese-based company and sell to a United States company, or begin to localize all data in the United States, as has been done by a number of other countries with regards to TikTok, forcing them that if you're going to collect information on our citizens, it has to be here, and we have to be able to, not always access it, but at least secure it. And so Congress passed a very sweepingly bipartisan bill. I don't even know who objected to it, if anybody did, to set a timeline that TikTok had until the remainder of this year. So it was about a 9-month period to do so, to sell the company to a non-adversary owned entity, or it would be facing a ban in the United States app stores by mid-January. And so the clock is running out, and there's been just a flurry of attention to this issue of whether or not Trump may change course on what his original position was, given the role that TikTok and young voters played in his success, as well as shifting national security concerns and considerations with the business.
Now, I'd like to explore that possible shift on Trump's part, but not before I ask you, so what exactly has TikTok's parent company done since that bill was signed back in April by President Biden? Have they taken any action to divest themselves to a third party?
No, they've indicated no intentions of shifting, which really, I think, to so many lawmakers on both sides of the aisle has illuminated the fact that, if TikTok was operating as a truly private entity, it would have done what is in the best interest of its financial future, which would be to sell to a company not based in China. It would make them lots of money. It would allow them to continue to operate in which is the absolute biggest market possible. And they haven't done that. And instead, they fought it, and they took really aggressive lobbying actions in Congress, sent out messages to swarms of users, particularly young users, to contact their lawmakers to stop this ban, which, if you read the news reports on it, was rather outrageous and somewhat scary. Threats by young children being made towards lawmakers. And they've continued to show no interest in any kind of reform, and trying to negotiate the data localization that other tech companies have dealt with. and rather trying to just force a complete overturning of the ban. They've gone through local courts and now the district courts, which have all upheld the ban and they're currently appealing to the Supreme Court, but it seems rather bleak for their case to be made in such a short period of time.
And I'm sure this is a huge oversimplification, but is the reason that ByteDance hasn't taken action because of the influence of the Chinese Communist Party?
I think is one of the challenging things about discussing and debating this issue is a lot of this is hindering on intelligence information that we as ordinary people cannot know. I mean, I think if they fully declassified the level of connections between ByteDance and the CCP, it would be rather shocking and alarming. But just the broad coalition of voices on this issue, people that are, very, free market driven, very liberty driven, still being committed to continuing this ban really shows, that there is very clearly a close alignment between the Chinese Communist Party and the executives, and particularly both the access to data, which is always a concern, but I think is becoming even less and less as it seems to be so easily accessible through hacks of so many different platforms, but really the influence that TikTok holds as a social media platform. And we've seen a lot of reporting on the role it played in young voters' opinions on Israel-Palestine, young people's perspectives on the hurricanes that impacted South Florida. And so I think the concern is particularly in the influence, as well as this data level, but I think it's pretty severe at this point.
So yeah, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who are knowledgeable about social media platforms and who've told me, look, if you really want to grow your footprint out there, you need to be on TikTok. And the question in the back of my mind is always, okay, but at what cost? And you list a number of some of the things that really need to be considered there. Is there a data risk? Is this information being used and stored by the CCP? And it's not that I'm worried that they're going to come after me personally, but that is definitely, not necessarily an organization I'd like to partner with, in terms of social media.
Yeah, I think the influence part is so concerning because of how subliminal it can be. I mean, you go from scrolling through platforms now and looking at harmless, ordinary content to suddenly it's feeding in, we've seen the complete craziness with really toxic content targeted towards young men and trying and completely distorting their worldviews and perspectives on different issues. In that case, we've seen this on a number of natural disasters, the drones now here in New Jersey, that so quickly a distorted image gets shared around and it reaches mass audiences. And while I think it's concerning across the internet, it's no place like TikTok. I mean, the way in which things spiral out of control on TikTok is unheard of, and there's no community notes. It's much harder to interject and call things out in the way that people do elsewhere because of the streaming platform of which it's structured.
Is there anyone that comes close as a peer competitor in terms of social media, or is TikTok just miles ahead of everybody at this point?
I think that should the ban stay intact and pass, we'll see a pretty quick replacement. Though Instagram Reels is growing as it is, and I think that other competitors will rapidly, create a very similar app that, frankly, the United States isn't going to care about the copyright of TikTok once it bans it, and it will just be replaced.
Interesting. I wonder if the demands that are being made of TikTok likewise would weigh on the minds of homegrown social media platforms that are maybe trying to take off, if they wonder if they would be dictated to in a similar fashion.
I think that there's going to be continued considerations about data localization and our cybersecurity as we continue to see more and more concerning activity by China and other adversarial countries, for sure.
All right. Once again, we are talking with Sam Rouse. He is a Tech and Consumer Freedom Fellow with Young Voices. Sam, where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me at X at SamRouse1.
Very good. All the best to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me today.